you are. I can't hear you
Turn that
yet.
on.
Oh, I can hear you now.
Excellent. I just had to push all the right icons.
Look at your gorgeous backdrop there.
Well, this is really my bookcase, but all my books a lot of my books are kind of on the floor because I've had so many Zoom meetings and interviews. I needed to
I like it though. You're repurposing. I love it.
repurposing.
Well, thank you so much for spending some time with me. I know you're in hot demand right now, so I feel incredibly privileged to have a sliver of your time today, my dear. Thank you very much.
Well, but I will say that you were there early. So, the early birds are, the people I go to first.
Well, I appreciate that. And just to give everybody a little background, I think it was, gosh, Alilia, like 7, 8 years ago. Is that could
At
it
least.
at least, yeah, maybe
At
even
least.
10. So 8 to 10 years ago, I
Mm-hmm.
encountered Madame C.J. Walker as a historical figure, as an entrepreneur. I wrote something about her, and you reached out to me, and I was like, oh my gosh. I felt so incredibly moved that you reached out to me. And then we did an interview at that time, and you very generously sent me your book. And it's just been such a pleasure to watch the story unfold and get more traction and exposure and connectivity, and to watch you kind of ride that. Alilia is a journalist and a former TV producer and author. And I wanted to just talk today a little bit about story overall, and your own sort of both familial connection to this story, first of all, and your own kind of journey in taking this on as sort of the protector and documenter of memorializing her legacy.
Yeah, well, you know that there were just like little seeds that we've been planting for decades. And you picked them up, you saw those little seeds, and then those blossomed. And I've continued to work on this. And whether there was ever going to be a Netflix series or not, I was going to be telling Madame Walker's story, because I realized after all of those years of working as a producer, and I had a very exciting career, I was telling other people's stories, some really interesting stories, but here was this untold story that was sitting right there in front of me. I needed to do something with it.
Yeah, and I think it's so important because a lot of the work I focus on in storytelling and business, and the idea I try to express to people, is history is held by the victors, by a certain class of people, by those are the people who get to tell the stories, who get to memorialize the stories. And we so often don't even wonder at, pick at, explore all of these voices that are ultimately silenced. And it's interesting to me because she was the first American female millionaire, and yet still, even that extraordinary accomplishment was not enough, really, that anyone knew who she was up until really now. I mean, I think
Right.
that really now we're in sort of the heat of that. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that idea of taking ownership of highlighting her story, and this idea of silenced stories.
Well, definitely the way that most of us learned history in school, women and people of color have basically been erased from our history, which means we're really not learning history. We're really not learning the full story, because people feel better about themselves and they're able to assert themselves. And many people don't want you to assert yourself, and hence the necessity to erase your value, to erase your story. So I really write the books that I wish had been written for me. And I know that what means as much to me as anything else is a young girl doing a Black History Month report or Women's History Month report who somehow finds some piece of Madame Walker's life that inspires her, that pushes her to want to do something more. So people do relate to stories about people who look like them. Though I will say, I read a lot of biography in elementary school and there were no women of color who were in the biography series in my elementary school library. But I read about Newt Rockne, who was the coach for Notre Dame, and I found resonance in that. So everybody can find resonance in stories, and it really is important that we tell these stories that haven't been told, that may just be a little footnote in history, but really deserve to be a full-blown biography.
Yeah. And the other thing that I really sort of connected so deeply with her about is her understanding of how powerful her personal narrative was and owning that for herself and not allowing, particularly in the time she was born. Like, I always am just so moved by people who feel entitled to that story when the world is pushing back and saying, it's actually, you don't get that. But she really had command of that. She knew where that power was. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, you mentioned the first speech she gave and like telling her story and why that was so powerful to her and how she did that.
She really had to push forward because truly an uneducated washerwoman was at the very bottom of society. There was not anybody championing her. And she somehow knew innately that by telling her own story, she would inspire others. So it wasn't about, I'm telling my story because I'm so great. It's, I'm telling my story because I know that there's something that will resonate with other women, and I've been through something, maybe I can inspire them to change their lives, to catch some of that inspiration that's out there. So she began to learn this, I think, in her church in St. Louis. The women of the church, the more middle class, more educated women of the church began to give her a vision of herself as something other than an illiterate washerwoman. And once she began to change her life, to transform her life, she saw the power of her story to inspire others once they learned something about her. So when she went to the 1912 National Negro Business League Convention, the organization that had been founded by Booker T. Washington, she wanted to be on the program. And so we know what a big deal it is to be invited to give a keynote speech or even to be on a panel. Well, that would be the equivalent. And she wasn't invited to do either of them, but she still decided, at least in the question and answers opportunity, she was going to try to tell her story. And she sent a request to Washington, and he ignored her request on the first day. On the second day, her good friend George Knox, the publisher of a Black newspaper in Indianapolis, stood up and said, we should hear from Madame C.J. Walker. She has an incredible story to tell. She's the woman who gave $1,000 to the building fund of the YMCA in my hometown. And even though these two men had a great deal of respect for each other, Washington dismissed him, called on somebody who was Madame Walker's neighbor, and just kept moving the program forward. Now, Madame Walker maintained her pride and dignity, and on the third and final day of the convention, when she saw that he wasn't going to give her the opportunity to tell her story, she decided to seize the opportunity. She stood at her seat as the last banker was completing his report. And she looked toward Booker T. Washington at the podium, and she started to tell her story. She said, I am a woman who came from the cotton fields of the South. From there, I was promoted to the wash tub. From there, I was promoted to the kitchen. And from there, I promoted myself into the business of manufacturing hair goods and preparations. And I have built my own factory on my own ground. The story was so good that the next year he invited her back as a keynote speaker.
I mean, that story just moves me so much for so many reasons. As someone who works with so many women and so many people of color who now do not feel entitled, right? Do not feel that they get to, that just the idea of, she too had to fight for that space. Like she didn't get permission. She just took that space, which I think is in that moment, like such a staggeringly courageous thing to do, because yes, it worked out and she was powerful, but it could have gone a very different way. I mean, when you take up that kind of space in those kind of places, you don't know the outcome. And so just the moral courage to do that, to me, is just staggering and such a gorgeous example of what is required. And you can't, you know, I say this all the time, like the cavalry isn't coming. You cannot wait for the white horse. You have to saddle your own white horse. You have to build your own, you know, and she was such a just absolutely stunning example of that.
You know, I think you have made me think about this as an element of doing your own origin story, about branding, about telling it. And I'm thinking about the actual words that she used. And the whole speech is maybe about 1,000 words. So let's
Mhm.
say that's about 4 minutes. I actually have to go back and look at it, and
Yeah.
I will send you that so you can post it,
Oh, I would
um,
love
so
that.
everybody can have it. Because that's a little snippet of it. But when I think about what she decided to say, had she planned it? Was it straight from the heart? Is this a story, like Martin Luther King had said, I've been to the mountaintop. He had said that before April 3rd, but
Mhm.
he pulled that, or that some of the things he said on the March on Washington, he had said some of those things before, but they all came together. So was she pulling from other speeches? Was she pulling from other conversations and had really distilled this to its most important pieces, so that when she got up in this moment, she really, in a way, had been rehearsing it, maybe not consciously, but had been rehearsing it, and she knew the power of the specific words that she said. She didn't ramble. She got right to the point. She made many points, but that is probably part of a key. It's not the elevator speech, but it is a sort of, what is your origin story and how do you distill it?
And I think too, just I mean, in any given environment, but just also the confidence to embrace your origin story, where a lot of people feel a lot of shame around it. And she even then saw the currency in that story. And for me, that belief is, I am you. I too came from here and then moved from here. And then that idea of not manufacturing this shiny persona of somebody who was other than anyone than who she was and where she came from, and understanding even then in that power. I think I know people who struggle with their origin story when they're in certain environments where they're like, well, I don't want people to know X or Y, but that is the thing that makes you uniquely you, and your point of view and your contribution so much more relevant than anyone else's, is that it is specifically your story. And I always say the specific is what makes something universal. It's that capacity of struggle, like incredible, profound struggle, that she was able to both embrace and communicate and sort of claim and own rather than shun or make quiet. I wonder,
Can,
as
can I
we,
just can I
yeah,
just add
please.
something to that? Because there's another part of this speech that I actually leave out, because I'm usually trying to just tell a story quickly to move on to the next story. But she does actually say the words, "I am not ashamed of my past,"
Yeah.
when I was a washerwoman. So that is definitely speaking to what you were saying, that she knew there would be other people in the audience who would look down on her
Yeah.
because she had been a washerwoman. And in fact, I think when people are speaking to an audience and they may think this person will look down on me, everybody has something
That's
that
right.
they're hiding and that they wish they had the courage to talk about. So you are actually, by saying something that sometimes that you may think is shameful or that's embarrassing, you have in a way given permission to most of the people in the audience who are not, haters, to be on your side.
Yeah, no, I love that you said that, because I always say, like, everybody's a little bit broken, as Brian Stevenson would say, like, we're all a little bit broken. And the most interesting, powerful part of you are the broken pieces. It's not the shiny, sort of pulled together pieces. It's the pieces that are cracked, because that's the universal piece, right? And so I'm curious to know too, for you, now that you've gone through this whole process of writing about her in a book format and other ways, talking about her in interviews, and now having this Netflix special, what is the most important part of her story that you want people to that you want to live inside of people and not let go of, that they don't forget? Because I also know intuitively when these things get created in these kinds of popular culture contexts, right, some of the history and some of the real heartbeat of this human being can be quieted or distorted in some way. And I was wondering if there's anything you just would want people to deeply know about her, and take away from this experience.
But yes, the Netflix series is definitely a Hollywood version. And so that's why I have all these books behind me, because I hope that it may have inspired people and entertained them. And I hope they enjoyed Octavia Spencer, because I think she was fabulous.
She was.
Costumes were fabulous. The wigs were fabulous. no, all of those things. And now millions of people know Madam Walker's name. So that I am very happy about. But I do hope that people realize that 90% of what's in there is a Hollywood dramatization and sort of hyped and taken to the next level. And one of the things that's really important to me about Madam Walker is that she empowered other women.
Yeah.
And provided jobs for them, provided independent incomes for women. 90% of African Americans were living in the South, in the rural South during around 1910. So around the time she was just on her rise. And most Black women who worked, and many had to work, were maids and laundresses and cooks and sharecroppers. And her company, the Madame C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company, by allowing these women to sell products and to train them as beauty culturists, as she called them, gave them an independent income. They were able to buy homes, to educate their children, to invest in real estate, and in some instances to create generational wealth for their families. But the other part of that story is that there were women who mentored her before she was able to empower other women. And that is one of the key things that's missing from the Netflix series from me. What we don't see is those women of St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church who embraced Sarah Breedlove, the poor washerwoman, widowed woman with a young girl when she moved to St. Louis in the late 1880s, who began to give her a vision of herself as something other than an illiterate washerwoman, who, when she joined the choir, made sure that she might need a piece of clothing that they would give her, so she was as well dressed as everybody else. Now, she was a washerwoman, so her clothes were always, impeccable, what she had, but somebody else was looking out for her, made sure that she educated her daughter and that she was exposed, helped her improve her grammar. There was one woman in particular, Jessie Batts Robinson, who was a school teacher, who was in a leadership role in a women's organization, whose husband was a publisher of one of the Black newspapers in St. Louis. So that was somebody who mentored her. And then she surrounded herself with other people who could enhance her standing, who could help her become more educated. One of her key hires was her attorney, F.B. Ransom, a young attorney who'd been educated at Columbia University, and a woman named Alice Kelly, who was the manager of her factory. They called her the forelady of the factory. We'd say she was the manager now. But she had been the dean of girls at a Black boarding school in Kentucky. She traveled with Madam Walker, helped her improve her grammar, helped her improve her speaking ability. So those are that sort of knack for surrounding herself with talented people and empowering them is very key for me to understanding who she was at her core.
Yeah, and to me that also challenges this very typical American dominant narrative of like pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and doing it on your own. And, I come from a culture of poverty, and it always like just makes me insane when there's this just prevalence of like somehow like I did something special because like I went and got a fancy education and got a job and did all the things. But the truth is there are a million little interactions of a million people who see you, who see the possibility of who you are, and who, while you are still feeling small and insignificant, see the possibility of who you have yet to become. And all of those collective people are really what make someone like a Madame C.J. Walker possible. She could not have done it but for those people in her community, in her church, in all these tiny ways that are part of her story too, that I think is also in such the counter to, again, this dominant American narrative of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Anybody can do it totally on their own and you need nothing and no one. This like ferocious American autonomous identity, which I think has some positive things and is also wildly inaccurate in a lot of ways.
Right. It's like, if only you would do this, if only you were more ambitious, if only you would have 5 jobs instead of 2, then you would not be in the position you're in. Yes, it is a very, uncharitable way. And people who are privileged, who really don't look and see what that difference is. I know with my own father, my father grew up in a family with 9 kids. You know, when I was growing up, that grandmother, their house still had an outhouse, still had, you know, you had to go out and pump the water. So but there was love in that house. There was encouragement in that house. And my father was like the third from the youngest. His mother sent him to kindergarten when he was 4 because there were new babies. But he was really rescued in a way. I mean, there was love in the house. His parents worked very hard. But it was one of his high school teachers, a homeroom teacher, who saw that he was smart but mischievous and was going to be getting in trouble. And she's the one who really made sure that he was going to be a good student. And she died at 102, and to her dying day, she said he was her favorite student. Oh. And so there was a great bond between them. But that was an example. Somebody sees you. Yep. And sees your spark, and you are receptive enough, and they can help you to move to the next thing.
Yeah, I think that too, I see her story as so many layers of an education of what it means to make your way in the world, right? To have the sort of sense of self-confidence and self-value to ask for what you want, to even have, frankly, the imagination and the desire, because I think that lots of people don't feel entitled to have the imagination and desire for fear the world will tell you, like, who the hell do you think you are to want X, Y, or Z? And she had all that. And in addition to all of that, again, I say all the time, like, everybody is wildly powerful to impact someone's story in the smallest way. And that story about your father is such a gorgeous example of that. Just having this teacher that saw him as not problematic, but energetic. Right?
Right.
Not
exactly.
Not troublesome, but lively and interesting and creative. And it's so interesting to me, just when you look at any narrative, just how powerful one single, otherwise could have been insignificant human being can change the course of your life just by seeing you.
Just by seeing you. And then he, in turn, was a successful businessman and then ran a program where thousands of young people ultimately went through a leadership program. And no matter where I go, if somebody hears my name, Bundles, it's not about Madam Walker necessarily. It's, are you Henry Bundles? Are you related to Henry Bundles? You know, I mean, so that shows you, it really does make a difference. There is something shining in each person.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you talk a little bit also just about, because I remember when I was reading her story, not so much watching it, but reading it, just her, like, how creative and dynamic she was around marketing and how smart she was about that. And can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's so interesting in a time where we think like we're just like marketing's brand new or something. And even then, like, how very dynamic and creative she was with her strategy and her thinking around that.
She used every tool available. I really am convinced she would have been on Instagram, you know, and with a million followers, because she had that origin story that was so important, and because she was interacting with both famous people and everyday people. So she would have been generating those stories. But yes, she really was a marketing genius. And some of it you can see both in her advertisements. She advertised extensively in the Black press. She said you first have to have a high quality product, though. That was the key. And then you have to market it. So many of the Black publishers, newspaper publishers around the country said she helped keep them in business because she paid her bills on time. As she traveled around, she did speeches. And remember, this is before most communities had movie theaters, or certainly before television, certainly before computers and the internet long ago. But when she would go to town, she would take out a little ad in a newspaper a few days ahead of time. She had already contacted the local minister. She knew where she was going to stay. And so then she would be the big event for the week or maybe the month. And over time, she started traveling with what she was a stereopticon. That was a device that was glass slides with the photos, with the images projected like a PowerPoint presentation. Yes. And she would give a lecture that would be really about Black current events and education and business, with images from her company, from other companies, from other Black schools. And then after the big event, she would gather 10 or 15 women who now were sort of excited to be identified with Madam Walker, and talk to them about her products. And she could see when, with that smaller group, who was the woman who asked the best questions? Who was the person the other women gravitated towards? And then she would make that woman her lead agent because she could see the leadership skills. And then she would move on to the next town. So she really was marketing, advertising. There's one, she sort of every little holler, as you would think.
Yeah.
Remember in cowboy movies, when a train is going through the town and the train slows down and you see the conductor put this bag, the mail bag, up onto the hook and then take the one. So it was a town too small to stop in, but you still had to deliver the mail. One of her secretaries, who was still working for the company in the late 1970s,
Wow.
told me that when Madam Walker would travel, she always had order forms. She would make arrangements with her local agent in a small town. And she would say, I'm coming through on the train. It gets to whatever town at 2:34 on Tuesday. Be there. And as the train slowed down, they would throw off a little packet of order forms and then take whatever the agent had to give to her. So she was working it every single way.
Yeah, she was looking at recruiting, sort of all of the elements, right? She was looking at supply chain, all of these complicated things in this really rudimentary way. But I just love how dynamic she was in her thinking and creative. And it feels like in some way that origin story freed her from being afraid to try those things. She had already done the hardest thing. You know what I mean?
That's right.
It's like she had done the hardest thing. So all of these other things just seemed much more possible, or at least that's how I, perceive it when reading about her.
I think that's right. And I think that part of it is that she knew that her situation was a very common situation, that there were women who had to work. How do you work? For the most part, women were doing this at home. Some had beauty salons, but for the most part, they were trying to find ways to not have to work in somebody else's house, to be able to be with their children. So she was sort of doing a two-pronged approach. Yes, she was selling products to women who needed solutions for their scalp infections so their scalps would be healthy, so their hair could grow back. But they also needed education and they needed income. So she would use testimonial ads. And in one ad where she had a before and after picture, kind of like Jenny Craig, the before picture is her hair is very short, and the after picture, her hair is long and healthy and bushy. She put testimonial letters in one of these ads. And one came from one of her customers who said, before I started using Madam Walker's wonderful hair grower, my hair was 1/8 of an inch long. And now my hair is down my back and I have been able to throw my wig away. So there was that part of I'm addressing some of your beauty needs, but there was also the part of how do you create income? And another testimonial letter said, you have made it possible for a Black woman to make more money in a day selling your products than she could in a month working in somebody's kitchen.
Wow.
So this was like, she was relating to women who were very much like she was.
Yeah. And just that whole, again, that harnessing the story and proselytizing, like she understood that like stories have legs and those testimonials are like, that's what travels. Like at some point, her own story would only go so far. And then taking the stories of those who had been whose lives had been transformed by becoming, not just by using the product, but by selling the product, and how that changed their financial life, how that changed the possibility of who they could become. So I love that kind of relation to not just her own narrative, but then also pulling those narratives up of the people who worked for her as well.
I just had an image of a young Oprah early shows where she had her own origin story, which she told sometimes, but it was bringing other people up and letting them tell their difficult stories, giving them a platform.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to be extremely respectful of your time today, but before we go, I just want to ask you, where is the best place to get all of your books for about Madame C.J. Walker? Because I know that I came to this as your book, not the Netflix series, which was lovely, but I think everyone should also read about her. So I would love for you to talk about that a little bit before we close out.
Sure. So yes, thank you so much. But it's just so good to reconnect with you after all this time and to see the wonderful things that you're doing and to have Madam Walker's story continue to be a part of the story that you're telling. But people can find me on my websites. One is aleliabundles.com, ALELIA bundles.com. And that's where I post my blog, and I have my newsletter and videos and other books that you can buy. And then we have a separate MadameCJWalker.com website that I really designed initially for kids who are doing reports, so I could punch a button, but it really is, it gives a lot of good history on her. So that's MadameCJWalker.com. And I'm on Twitter and Instagram, of course, at Alelia Bundles, and on Facebook, Alelia Bundles /author. So I'm pretty out there, and I would love for people to visit the sites, maybe sign up for the newsletter, and follow me on Twitter and Instagram.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so very much for the privilege of your time and sharing Madame C.J. Walker's story and your story as well. You are such a pleasure, and I just feel so delighted that all this is happening for you because you have worked so hard to preserve this her legacy that really serves all of us. So thank you so much for that.
My pleasure.
Take good care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.